Certain vehicles are used to transport things between locations. Additionally, there are automobiles that play a significant role in shaping history. The pug-nosed tiny van parked outside the bakery, roaring down the narrow lane with the morning milk, or sitting calmly at the curbside as a nurse emerged with her bag were all things that most people in post-war Britain seldom gave much thought to. They just regarded it as a natural feature, as permanent and ordinary as a terraced house or a red telephone box. However, that little van was concealing something remarkable. Its pressed steel body told a tale of quiet revolution, post-war ambition, and flexibility that made it one of the most socially significant cars to ever come out of a British manufacturer. This is Bedford, California, and what you are going to learn will forever alter your perception of it. In 1952, Britain was still in the process of reconstruction. The period of rationing has barely ended. The nation required a vehicle that could travel, deliver, and perform in an economical and dependable manner. More than most, the men at Bedford's Luton facility were aware of that need. In order to provide slightly more load room while maintaining easy maneuverability for usage in Britain's numerous tiny lanes, many of which date back to pre-medieval times, Bedford started developing the CA in the late 1940s while researching competitors like the Morris J-Type and Ford Thames. When the CA eventually made its debut at the 1952 Commercial Motor Show, it was more than just a van. It was a response to a national need. And this is the first thing that most people who believe they are familiar with this car find shocking. The Bedford CA was referred to as the Ford Transit of its era because it was so commonplace and could be found in every town, county, and street corner in Britain. However, the Transit didn't start operating until 1965. For 13 years, the CA had already been performing that function. It quietly set the standard for what a British light commercial van might and should be before anyone else had even sketched the idea on paper. It was more than 10 years ahead of Ford's iconic workhorse. That timing is important. That precedent is important. However, history has essentially given the Transit its crown, leaving the CA in the background. The first shock is that unfairness, and we're only getting started. In order to maximize luggage space in the back without making the van excessively long, the design team chose a semi-forward control layout, positioning the driver's seat over the front axle. For the time, its engineering was quite astute. The outcome was a vehicle that, despite its small size, felt remarkably spacious inside. A psychological trick of design that gave the impression that the CA was more powerful than its actual size. Both short wheelbase and long wheelbase versions of the CA were produced, with 10 to 12 hundredweight and 15 hundredweight versions available. That adaptability wasn't a coincidence. From the beginning, Bedford wanted the CA to be a platform rather than merely a product. The truly amazing part of the narrative is what builders and converters did with that platform. The Bedford CA is one of the few commercial vehicles that can truly claim to have influenced social history. It launched the post-war camper van revolution in 1952. Take a moment to consider that. It wasn't a fancy touring vehicle that contributed to the development of the British camping vacation. It was a simple delivery truck. The fully outfitted Dormobile was eventually created by Kent-based coach builders Martin Walter, who regarded it as the ideal option for their multi-purpose conversions that could serve as a van, estate car, minibus, and overnight sleeper. Together with the Volkswagen Type 2, they helped establish post-war British and European camping culture by equipping the CA with a pop-up top, fold-down beds, and small cooking facilities, turning the modest work van into a sought-after weekend and vacation vehicle. The ability to travel wherever the road went, with a bed and a kettle waiting at the other end, was something that working families had never enjoyed before, thanks to the Bedford CA Dormobile. That is more than just a van fact. In terms of social liberty, that is true. Stay tuned, though, for the next discovery is more profound than most car historians would like to acknowledge. A 1.5-litre overhead valve four-cylinder engine with 49 brake horsepower drove the original CA. The Vauxhall F-Series Victor passenger car also had the same engine and 3-speed gearbox. To put it another way, a working van and a family saloon shared a mechanical heart, which meant that parts were readily available, mechanics were familiar with the engines, and repair costs were still affordable for small firms. This shared platform approach was brilliant, not lazy. For the duration of its production life, it guaranteed the CA's viability across cost-conscious fleets. However, that engine had a secret of its own. Any 3-speed Bedford CA may be readily converted to a 4-speed gearbox from later FC series cars, which were eventually made available as a factory option. Owners who were aware of this may easily increase the capabilities of their van without purchasing a new car. This is a sort of mechanical upgrade path that seems nearly contemporary in its reasoning. The majority of people completely ignore another aspect of the CA's manufacturing life, which has a direct bearing on the field of British public service. Numerous fleets around Britain soon adopted the Bedford CA as their standard light commercial vehicle. Police, emergency services, and the Royal Mail all operated them in significant quantities. Newspapers and dairies relied on CAS for daily distribution, and utility companies and small retailers also embraced them. This was not an accident. It was the outcome of a car that public institutions trusted with life or death duties because it was so reliable and affordable. In post-war designs that prioritized rapid access and medical equipment, ambulance conversions used high roof extensions on the CA van for patient transport, holding up to 6-seated cases in standard models or 4 stretchers in others. Your neighbor may have been transported to the hospital by the same van that delivered your morning post. One of the most underappreciated aspects of this vehicle's legacy is that duality, that unassuming, daily heroism. We have now reached a realization that, once heard, cannot be undone. Thousands of ice cream vans with all-glass front designs for vendor visibility and refrigerated units driven by the van's engine were modified in the 1960s by companies like Morrison Electrofreeze of Southampton, making them one of the most recognizable applications of the CA. Your neighbor may have been transported to the hospital by the same van that delivered your morning post. One of the most underappreciated aspects of this vehicle's legacy is that duality, that unassuming, daily heroism. We have now reached a realization that, once heard, cannot be undone. Thousands of ice cream vans with all-glass front designs for vendor visibility and refrigerated units driven by the van's engine were modified in the 1960s by companies like Morrison Electrofreeze of Southampton, making them one of the most recognizable applications of the CA. The significance of this vehicle to individuals cannot be further illustrated. Not merely a machine, a recollection, a life. This is a whole other kind of shock, one that illustrates the CA's influence outside of Britain. As part of the Envoy brand lineup, the CA was also exported to Canada and marketed as the Envoy CA. Before British cultural influence started to fade and American competitors like the Chevrolet Sport van made the imported British van more and more difficult to justify in the North American market, they were offered in Canada from 1957 to 1963. The CA attempted to raise its flag on a continent that was traveling in a completely different way after crossing an ocean. Although it didn't succeed in conquering Canada, the fact that it made an effort and discovered that consumers were prepared to prefer a quirky Luton-built van over domestically produced American competitors speaks volumes about the vehicle's personality and the cultural confidence of its time. Over the course of its 17-year construction, the CA's overall appearance barely changed. Bedford's approach to the CA was almost philosophical in its austerity in a market where yearly model revisions and cosmetic refreshes were the main marketing weapons. Throughout its existence, it was sold in 3 different variants, each with minor but significant improvements. The initial CAS had a 2-piece windscreen made up of 2 distinct flat glass sheets divided by a vertical metal split in the middle. A slightly curved single unit took the role of the split screen when curved glass became more reasonably priced in Britain. The third version, which went on sale in late 1964, had a pressed aluminum alloy front grille for the first time and a substantially deeper windscreen. Every modification was practical rather than trendy, with a focus on ongoing, subtle improvement as opposed to dramatic reinvention. Bedford wasn't following fads. It was hearing from the men and women who drove and depended on the CA on a daily basis. This leads us to the last and, in many respects, most eerie fact. The The CA was lovingly referred to as the Tilly and had a very lengthy production life with only minor modifications. When the Bedford CF took its place in 1969, production came to a stop. The CF was built to directly compete with the increasingly powerful Ford Transit and featured independent front suspension for better handling. That fight would be decisively won by the Transit. The cab, which was once commonplace on every street and lane in Britain, became actually uncommon in the decades that followed. The cars that have survived are the result of someone's decision to maintain, repair, and preserve them. Over the course of its 17-year production cycle, some 370,000 Bedford CAS were produced. Only a tiny portion of those are left today. Each of them is a survivor not just of rust and traffic, but also of forgetting, of a society that went on without stopping to bid farewell to the little pug-nosed van that had served it so devotedly. The Bedford CA was never a glitzy place. It was never quick. It never appeared on a spotlight-draped motor show stand. However, it transported the ill, carried the letters, chimed through the summer streets, provided refuge for families sleeping under the stars, and sustained the modest businesses of a nation in recovery. Unseen, unacknowledged, and completely essential, it was the backbone of post-war Britain. Perhaps you will view it a little differently the next time you see one of the surviving handful at a rally or hidden away in a barn now that you know its story. Not as a relic. Not out of curiosity. However, I was a witness to all that Britain was and all that it aspired to be.